The PTA meeting had been a blur. I'd sat at the back, staring at my notepad and trying to look engaged in the conversation as the other parents discussed extracurricular activities and reading programs. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by a mixture of desire and guilt. It had all started innocently enough. I'd been asked to volunteer for the PTA by my wife, who thought it would be a good way for me to get involved in our daughter's school life. Reluctantly, I agreed. That's how I met Mrs. Cooper, the PTA president. She was a petite woman with short blonde hair and bright blue eyes that sparkled with intelligence. A lawyer by trade, she ran the meetings with efficiency and charisma, commanding everyone's attention. We found ourselves sitting next to each other at every meeting, sharing small talk about our children and their progress in school. We discovered that we shared similar concerns about education and quickly developed a rapport. Then one night after a particularly long meeting, she suggested we go for a drink to unwind. "I feel like I'm drowning in paperwork," she said with a sigh. "I could really use a break." I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. My wife didn't usually mind if I went out for drinks with friends, but there was something about Mrs. Cooper that made me nervous. We ended up at a small bar down the street from the school, nursing cocktails and talking about anything but PTA business. "You must be very proud of your daughter," Mrs. Cooper said with a smile. I nodded. "She's doing well in school," I replied modestly. "And your wife? Is she involved in her education as well?" I hesitated before answering. "Not as much as she could be," I admitted. Mrs. Cooper looked thoughtful for a moment before leaning closer to me, her voice dropping to a low whisper. "Between you and me, I think a lot of the fathers could do more to support their children's education." I blushed, suddenly feeling like I was being scolded. "I try my best," I said defensively. She smiled and reached out to pat my hand reassuringly. "I know you do," she said kindly. "That's why I asked you to be on the PTA." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then she leaned even closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she spoke. "You're a good father," she whispered seductively. "And a very attractive man." I felt a shiver run down my spine as her words washed over me. My heart began to race, and I could feel heat pooling between my legs. Before I could respond, she pulled back and gave me an innocent smile, as if nothing had happened. "I should probably be getting home," she said casually as she signaled the bartender for the check. I nodded dumbly, trying to process what had just happened. Had Mrs. Cooper really just flirted with me? As we walked back to our cars in awkward silence, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been in my imagination. But then she turned to me with a mischievous smile and said, "This was fun. We should do it again sometime." My heart skipped a beat as I nodded in agreement. And that's how it started. I couldn't help but let my mind wander back to that night at the bar with Mrs. Cooper as I sat in the PTA meeting. Her flirtatious words and seductive whispers had left a lasting impression on me, stirring up desires that I'd long suppressed. Guilt gnawed at me for even entertaining such thoughts, considering I was a married man. But there was something undeniably alluring about Mrs. Cooper, and I couldn't shake the attraction. As the discussion around me droned on, my attention snapped back into focus when Mrs. Cooper's voice called out my name. "Steve, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this matter," she said with a smile that held a hint of playfulness. Caught off guard, I stammered for a moment before attempting to contribute something vaguely intelligent to the conversation. The other parents nodded along politely, but it was clear that my mind was elsewhere. Once the meeting finally came to an end and parents began to file out of the room, Mrs. Cooper approached me with a knowing glint in her eyes. "It seems like your mind was elsewhere tonight," she re-steeved, tilting her head slightly as if studying me. I felt a flush of embarrassment rise to my cheeks as I tried to come up with an excuse or explanation for my zoning out during the meeting. But then she leaned closer and lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I have to admit," she said softly, "I've been wondering if you've been thinking about that night at the bar as much as I have." My heart started pounding in my chest at her words, realizing that she had caught onto my distraction and recognized its cause. I stammered again, unsure of how to respond to her bold admission. She smiled knowingly and placed a hand on my arm reassuringly. "Don't worry," she said gently. "I won't tell a soul. But if you're interested, perhaps we could find a way to explore those thoughts together." I felt a rush of desire surge through me at her words, the guilt and hesitation momentarily forgotten. The idea of indulging in this forbidden attraction with Mrs. Cooper was undeniably tempting. Before I could respond, however, the sound of my wife's voice calling my name from across the room snapped me back to reality. "Steve, are you ready to go?" she asked, looking at me expectantly. I glanced at Mrs. Cooper, who gave me a subtle nod and a promise for another time before stepping away to join the other parents who were saying their goodbyes. As I walked out of the school with my wife, I couldn't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, there was the familiar comfort and stability that came with our marriage. On the other hand, there was this intoxicating allure of exploring something new and exciting with Mrs. Cooper. The drive home was filled with idle chatter and mundane discussions about household chores and upcoming family events. But my mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Cooper and all the possibilities that lay between us. Once we were finally alone in our bedroom that night, I found myself torn between my loyalty to my wife and the overwhelming desire that had been ignited by Mrs. Cooper's proposition. As I prepared to get into bed, I noticed a text message notification on my phone. Curiosity piqued, I picked up my phone and unlocked it to see who had messaged me. It was from an unknown number but contained only 5 simple words: "Are you ready to play?" My heart raced as I realized it must be from Mrs. Cooper. The anticipation built within me as I considered how to respond, weighing the consequences against the potential thrill of indulging in this secret affair. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I typed out my response: "Yes, I'm ready to play."